It looks like we still gotta have some chicken and coleslaw and salad left. Feel free to take it later. Now, it is our last Econ Club event this semester. I'm great that we have such a high turnout. It's a great honor for us to host a guest lecture by Professor Josh Hall. Professor Josh Hall is Associate Professor of Economics at West Virginia University. And he's also running the Free Enterprise Center. And he's also running the graduate program at West Virginia University. So if you're interested in pursuing graduate degree program in economics, feel free to talk to Professor Hall after the guest lecture. Now, Professor Hall, he has outstanding research record. His publications include top economic journals. I can talk about you for a long time. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Hall, who's going to talk about economic freedom and well-being.
Thank you very much, Lee. It's my great honor to have the opportunity to come to Loyola and talk. I've been hearing about Loyola for quite a long time, and I'm in intellectual debt to one of your professors. I'm going to talk today about economic freedom, and the report that I'm a co-author on, the Economic Freedom of the World Report, the first edition of this. It's a little too small, I can't find a better image. This name right here says Walter Block, and my co-authors in the index said no one thought deeper about economic freedom and what it means to measure economic freedom than Walter Block, and so we're all in his disservice. But I have to, I'm sorry, disservice, we're all in his service and gratitude for that, and I was going to say that I'm very grateful, though, that he has a faculty meeting, because it would be quite intimidating to give this talk with him in the room. Okay. So what am I going to do today? I want to give you an overview of economic freedom. You might be a big fan of what you know about being economic freedom. You might not be. I want to say why economic freedom is an important thing, and it's an important thing to measure, even if you don't care about it directly. Talk about some of the difficulties with measuring economic freedom, how we go about doing that, and then, since going back to that 96 report that Walter was a co-author on, a lot of people have taken our index and used it to try to explain other things. Some of these things are good things, such as growth. Other things are bad things, like deforestation, environmental degradation. I just finished a reading of over 400 plus articles that use our index, and economic freedom seems to be positively related to just about any type of thing that you think about as being good economic well-being, and is negatively related to bad stuff. So, we often teach, right, what's the acronym in STAFL? There is no such thing as a free lunch. Economic freedom seems to be one of those free lunches. We can have more economic freedom for those people who want to consume more economic freedom. And there doesn't seem, with a minor exception that I'll talk about at the end, any trade-off whatsoever. I should say also, please feel free to interrupt me as I go along. I hate to have you kind of sit with like this question, and by the time the end happens and they go to Q&A, you're like, well, I don't really know what my question was, or I can't articulate it as well. So just throw a hand up, feel free to interrupt me. It's easier for me to adjust on the fly. So why is the economic freedom of the world important? Why is it important to measure economic freedom? Well, I could go around the room and I could ask each of you, okay, we have this thing, economic freedom. Just like we could have done the same thing with GDP in 1933. How do we measure the output of an economy? How do we measure economic freedom? And you might all have the same general idea what economic freedom is, but if we had to go out and get data we might come to very different outcomes based on the data we chose. Okay, so part of my motivation goes back to I'm sitting in a social studies class, high school social studies class in the 80s, and I remember Reagan was wrapping up his second term, and people were talking about, well, has the Reagan years been a success or failure? And I just found the whole debate kind of unsatisfying because we're all like arguing from one data point, right? Like, oh, marginal tax rates came down. It was a success. We won the Cold War. It was a success. Government spending went through the roof. It was a failure. There's no complete picture that came about, and I'm not saying economic freedom provides a complete picture, but it provides us a broader picture that gets us away from just yelling back and forth about, basic things. It also matters for bigger questions. So this graphic here comes from the best-selling economics textbook of all time. It comes from Economics by Paul Samuelson. If any of your folks took economics in college, they probably were taught from this textbook. What this figure shows is it norms. You all see that? I know it's a little light. It norms 1960 to 100. It says the U.S. is growth. Well, set the U.S. growth at 100 in 1960. The USSR's growth rate are half of what the U.S. is in. But Samuelson predicts over time the USSR will grow faster, and by 1999, somewhere in the mid-90s, will overtake the United States. Now, this was probably a good guess based on available data that Samuelson had at the time when he first created this graph. He erred in a couple ways. One is he took the Soviet data at face value. Two, I think his theory was wrong. So what's the implicit theory of this? The theory is that more planned economies are going to grow faster. Okay. Well, what does it mean to be more planned? Well, you have less economic freedom, fewer decisions made by individuals as opposed through collective decision making. So it matters fundamentally for answering questions like, well, was Samuelson wrong in the specific, but he could be right in the general? Right? Well, we need more than one data point. We need to look across countries. Then you have Milton Friedman in his famous 61 book, Capitalism and Freedom, making this claim that he knows of no other example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. But, I mean, he's just like, I can't think of one. But what does it mean to be politically free? What does it mean to organize the bulk of economic activity? Right? Maybe without a concrete definition of both of those things, we might be missing the examples of countries that are economically free but not politically free. I mean, I'll give you some examples of those when I get to our measure of economic freedom. And so without any sort of measurement, our knowledge is in some ways incomplete. We can speculate, but so is economic freedom a good? I would argue it's a good like GDP. GDP has its problems, right? Any principles class will talk about all the problems of GDP, right? It doesn't measure home production, for example. Right? We consume more leisure, we're better off because we voluntarily decided to consume more leisure, but you measure GDP goes down. We wouldn't say that we're worse off even though measure GDP goes down. So economic freedom is a thing I think we can measure if there's issues. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think some of the issues are once I explain what it is. But people appear to want more than other things being equal. And there might be trade-offs, right? If we go back to that Samuelson, he's positing a trade-off here. U.S., you want to be more economically free? Well, Soviet Union's going to overtake you. So there might be downsides to more economic freedom. And so we should measure it because we want to discover what those downsides are, or if there are any downsides. But I want to be clear, the index can only measure, we only try to measure economic freedom. I'm not making, it's ideological in the sense that I'm going to talk about the theory of economic freedom. But other than that, we're just trying to measure it based on our theory as much as possible, right? So the ideology of GDP is goods and services are good. And so we're going to try to measure that as best as possible. I can't tell you what the optimal amount of economic freedom is. That's up for you to decide. Okay, so this is our measure. We come out every year. Our guiding principles are we think about an individual in a particular country and we say, okay, does that person have personal choice in all aspects of their life? Any sort of infringement upon the personal choice is by government is a constraint on their economic freedom. Okay, and we try to measure this in certain areas. Very important areas. Freedom to trade, both domestically and abroad. Freedom to enter, earn a living. What are the constraints on you entering and competing in the market? Do you have to ask permission of the government to have a license, right? Do you have to, for example, if you want to be a barber in Wisconsin, do 2,000 hours of cosmetology, right? So training in order to cut men's hair. Those types of constraints, those are constraints in your economic freedom. Now, we can have an interesting discussion on what sort of regulations are appropriate to achieve other goals, but theoretically that's a constraint on your economic freedom. And we take a very minimal state view of the government. The government has an obligation to protect private property and provide the rule of law, and so we try to measure those property rights and protections. Yes?
If a person takes the stance of, we need some regulation, it needs to be the right regulation, is there a way that you can measure the difference between, let's say, a regulation that says, you can't build a building that will fall down, and someone versus a regulation that says, you build this building, you must use precisely, this type of girder. You're like, well, what if, want to use a different girder that's just as good? No, you must use this girder.
So what you're saying is, can we identify regulations that are, some regulations are better than other regulations? I think there are people who would say we can do that. I don't do regulatory policy in specific, but I think there are people who say we can do that. Right? There wants to be more consistent with the goal. Like, for example, you might want some minimal training in barber schools, for example. You see a lot of people for a long time went away from shaving necks. Like, I get my neck shaved, and that went away for a long time because of concerns over HIV. Right? But now they realize, okay, here's the process, the regulatory process for sterilizing your equipment. That's part of the training. It takes all of 30 minutes just to walk you through why this is important, and now they've gone back to shaving necks, right? Versus Wisconsin requires men to go to beauty school and learn how to do makeup and everything else because they want to save on regulatory costs and put barbers and cosmetologists together, right? So it seems like it's a misfit. I think those are important questions. The problem I have, we try to measure the effectiveness of regulation in here, is we're essentially ruining our measure to say, do countries that have stricter regulations have different outcomes? Because we're baking in the good outcomes into the measurement, if that makes sense. Okay, just as Isaiah Berlin, if any of you are also philosophy majors, his essay, I think Two Ideas of Liberty, is kind of the basis, negative rights basis for our index. Okay, so I would love to see somebody produce a positive rights index, right to education, right to healthcare. We don't include things like that because our negative rights definition says that imposes an obligation on others. So these are rights that you can think of them as, you get these at birth, right? And you can enjoy them as long as you don't invade the similar rights. Okay, so economic freedom is very, very difficult to measure. As you can imagine, how do we take that very simple idea? You have the freedom to enter and compete in markets and measure it, and reduce it down to a single number. It took 6 conferences. Milton Friedman was behind this. It actually came out of the Mont Pelerin Society meeting. So the Mont Pelerin Society, it was founded by Friedrich Hayek in 1945. He was concerned about the rising wave of totalitarianism around the world, and said, okay, classical liberals around the world, we need to get together and talk about these things. And in the 1984 meeting, they were talking about, of all things, George Orwell's 1984. And there was a big debate about the Swedish welfare state, and Friedman kind of just thought that we were back and having this argument. We're arguing with the same data and putting different interpretations on it. And Mike Walker of the Fraser Institute says, you know what, let's try to measure this thing. And he brought together Nobel laureates like Doug North and Jim Buchanan and a lot of other top economists, including Professor Block. And they had 6 conferences over a number of years, including my co-authors, Jim Borky and Bob Lawson. Things got slowed down. Jim lost his eyesight during this process, but eventually that index came out in 1997 that you saw there with that will go on. So that index looks very different in some way. Theoretically, it's the same. In terms of what we measure, it's very different. Just because we have a bit more data available to us. We take data on 152 countries in the world in 42 different data streams, and we group them into 5 broad areas I'll talk about in a second. It's all third-party data. Okay, we try to be as transparent as possible, right? So anybody can go replicate what we do. So we take data from the World Bank, IMF, Global Competitiveness Report, World Bank's Doing Business Report. And we transform it on a 0 and 10 scale, where 0 is less economic freedom, 10 is more. You might be saying, well, what's 0? Well, it depends on the individual. It depends on the individual country. I'm sorry, it depends on the individual variable, right? And it also depends on questions like, well, what do we want to do? We want to measure how economic freedom is changing over time. Well, if 0 is going to change every year, we can't measure how economic freedom changed over time. So what we do is, if we fix in a particular year, let's say 1990, what was the highest and lowest in the world on that variable? So, I'll give an example of that in a second when I come to size of government. Okay? So remember, higher ratings mean more economic freedom. We try to impose some order on this by saying, okay, here are the main 5 areas. Now you might be thinking, looking at these, there's other things I think are important. Well, maybe they're subsumed in there. Remember, we have all these different, over 40 different components. But I think there's important things that are elements of economic freedom that we just don't have good data for. And I like to think, we see, what do you think we're missing? So size of government. A country so part of that debate in 1984 was, can Sweden be economically free when government consumption is over 50% of total consumption? So over half of all resources, half of all consumption decisions are made collectively, not individually. Can that be economically free? So that's what would go in there. If you have a large state-owned sector, where decisions of major firms are made collectively, like the post office, for example, writ large, versus a country where those decisions are made in private property. Is government protecting private property? Are judges independent? Do people think that the rule of law is protected? That's area 2. Sound money. Is government inflating away your value of your wealth? Is inflation high and variable? Do you have to ask permission to hold foreign currency? Many countries in the world, you need permission of the central bank of that country to hold currency that's not your own country's. Freedom of trade internationally, right? So tariffs, custom duties, anything related to trading internationally. And then finally, regulation of credit, labor, and business. Okay, I'm going to provide some finer detail in two of these areas here in a second. So area one, we have government consumption. Now, you ask most people, like, do you think government's too big? They're going to point at the size of government as a percentage of GDP. Our government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. We're too big because a third of, government spending is a third of GDP. Now, that is an important factor, but it avoids the question of the scope of government and the fact that governments can be involved in the economy in lots of ways without spending money. They can tell you what not to do. They can encourage other things. Transfers and subsidies. What are the distortions that come, from taking from Peter and paying Paul? Right? Government enterprise and investment. Is government either directly competing in certain markets, or is it crowding out private investment through government borrowing? And then top marginal tax rate. Now you might say, hey, you're double counting here. You have both government consumption, which comes from revenues. So by including taxes, you're double counting. Really the top marginal, it should say income tax rate, is trying to get at that deadweight loss. Right? That's a real cost to individuals' economic freedom, right? Even though we don't measure it on a balance sheet. Let's look at the 5B. I want to look at.
I'm just curious. I can see there could be a problem with trying to take a lot of individual measurements that might be valid themselves and you figure out how to weight them. Like how much is regulation worth compared to taxation? Like, how do you weight them? Has anyone ever, let's say, said like you don't like the idea of aggregating all this in like one number, but let's just run like a million different correlations of let's see the correlation between the tax rate and let's say lifespan.
Yeah, so
regulation and lifespan, like a million different correlations, at least that way you don't have to weight them.
There is, but even then you're implicitly, unless you're using the actual variable, the one component itself, right, then you're still implicitly, and even if you're using ours and not the actual measure, you're implicitly weighting because you're coming at a 0 to 10 scheme. Right. I will say, so you hit on two important questions that come out of the literature. One is, how important is the weighting? So we have 5 areas. We produce one number. I'll show you in a second. The U.S. We produce a number for the U.S. And we assume that size of governments, 20% of that. Rule of law is 20% of that. Sound money is 20%. Each area is 20%. So if we think about area 1, size of government being more than 20%, that means government consumption is only 5% of the total weight. Now you might, if you think like government's too big because it's making too many decisions collectively, you're going to think that's weighted way too low. So that's one of the reasons we're transparent. We let people weight it however they want and produce however index they want. But as it turns out, there's been lots of attempts to re-weight this stuff, and it doesn't change any of the results in terms of seeming to correlate better, unless you go to real extreme. I think government consumption is everything. Well, then, okay, maybe that's not a good measure of economic freedom. And that's one of the takeaways actually I'm going to talk about, is why I don't think government consumption itself is a good measure of economic freedom. Any other questions about area 1? Okay. Area 5B, the reason I want to talk about regulation is this is business, we think about business regulation, but really any sort of labor market regulation or regulation on business is, people will say, oh, you're pro-business. This is about economic freedom for individuals because these are talking about government regulations on hiring and firing, or whether individuals, there's mandated collective bargaining, right? But instead, if you think about everybody's individual Yes, there's business on one side. They have economic freedoms too. Who and how do I interact with other people, my employees? But on the employee side, it's an infringement upon your economic freedom to require you to be a member of a union in order to operate in a particular industry, right? Or I want to work 37 hours a week in France. Well, you can't. That's it. French is 36 hours a week. So those hours regulations are an infringement upon individual economic freedom. Biggest thing, by the way, conscription. Military conscription is one of the areas that we've seen dramatic improvement. We measure economic freedom and these components, many of these components, back in 1970. The average country in the world, as we measured in 1970, used conscription, used military conscription. I think between 18 and 24 months. Now the average country in the world has military conscription between 0, so none at all, and 6 months. I can't put a much finer, as we measure, we can't put a much finer point on that. But that's been a huge improvement for your economic freedom not to go fight. No, we still involve militarily, but you have the freedom to sell your labor to the highest bidder and not have to take 2 years of your life or more to military service. Now, again, military conscription might make good sense for other economic reasons. I think you're going to come with a model to predict that. I think we can do a pretty good model of predicting which countries still use military conscription. But it's been a huge improvement in economic freedom. Okay, here's some data. 10 most economically free countries in 2012. We have the top 10 and then 2 countries tied for 12. Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, Mauritius, and so on. And the USA and 12 tied with the UK. So I like a phrase I call, if you take econometrics, which I love it, I've done OLS, ordinary least squares. I like to use ocular least squares. That's where you just eyeball it. And you might see these countries have something in common. Or generally speaking. They're smaller, right? Some islands here, right? What's the biggest country population-wise? Canada. So this suggests that even though we're measuring economic freedom, like it's a thing we're measuring it, there might be underlying conditions that make it easier for some places to be economically free and not. Now, I should caution you, we have a problem here that we're kind of our sample's messed up, right? Because I said 152 countries, there's over 200 plus countries around the world. And so there's small countries that have small populations, are good trade, near good trade routes, but they're not even in the sample. Cuba, for example, right? We don't have good data. They're clearly not economically free. The US from 1970 to 2000 was always in the top 3. We've had a dramatic slide under the last 3 presidential terms. We were 17th last year. We've come back up to 12th, not because we've gotten great, but because a lot of countries around us got a little bit worse. And when you have rankings, these are rankings, it's easy to have other people move and drop down. Yes?
I think that would have to do with war on terror.
That's a great, so there's some things we can point to, and we can say, here's the cause of it. So the efforts to fight the Great Recession, right? So regardless of you on Keynesian spending, government consumption as a percentage of total consumption in the United States went up about 3 percentage points. So the US got worse in that area. But we've gotten a lot worse on almost all survey data related to the rule of law and protection of property rights. Now, that's survey data. It's asking people, business officials, individuals around the world, do you think the United States is adherent to the rule of law? Why is that the case? Well, the war on terror might be, if you think you're torturing people, right, that might be an underlying cause. I don't know. It's a survey. I can't point to it, unlike government consumption. But another clear evidence is it takes longer. It takes, I think, 4 times longer to clear customs today in the the United States than it did right before 9/11. Okay, that's a clearly related to stepped up security related to 9/11. And that's a tremendous cost on business and economic freedom of individuals in the United States and trade with people in other countries. So, but we've fallen in all 5 areas. All 5 of those areas the U.S. has declined. So it's hard to point at one thing. Yeah.
Do you find some factors actually kind of break the mold, considering like Singapore and Switzerland actually do have conscription for some, and even though they're in the top, or is there kind of other factors that push them that actually kind of cancel out those effects?
Yeah, I mean, obviously to be that high, they have to, right? I mean, they're great on, in some ways, great on everything else. Same with Chile, which is I think Chile's missing. I think you're asking why it's. There's an error in my. Yeah, Chile is missing. It's in the top 10, and they have conscription as well. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. I actually never thought of it. I think that's an interesting point. Like that's one of the few things that hasn't seemed to change from any of these countries. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they just tend to. The one thing you'll see, and I'll show this, all of these countries tend to be really, really open to trade. Like very low, almost non-existent tariffs, almost no time to clear custom. You can start a business in like 2 hours, right, in Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, if you look at the World Bank doing business data, it's crazy how quick and easy it is to start a business. Yes?
Sorry, I was just wondering, so in terms of, UAE is on the list, and I mean, so I'm assuming that when you surveyed people that are living currently in UAE, you only surveyed Emiratis as opposed to like people that are actually, I mean, it's a lot of like kind of like modern day slavery that's going on.
So this is this is an awesome question. Like I said, you know, there's there's all sorts of trade-offs you have to make when you're doing indices like this. And there's times where you're like, I'm trying to think of a representative person in those countries. So where do I think that we, because of the nature of the data, now we don't do any survey, the World Bank surveys. So it's unclear. I think there's 2 ways that it understates. So one is countries use guest workers, and you know, I think it's probably only reflecting citizen views. And in patriarchal society, all our measures of property rights, I think, are only, because it's survey based, are only picking up men's property rights. So I think there's countries that are overstated, and those are countries that our measures of property rights are not really reflecting the majority of the population. And so we've thought about ways we can we need some way to systematically try to reflect the differences between men and women across these countries, and we haven't been able to find something that's satisfying in terms of actually reflecting those differences. The World Bank produced a survey of women's property rights, but it wasn't useful for our purposes, but they recognize that as a problem, and it's something we continue to kind of work on. So I think that's right. Like here to give you a much broader example of that, but it's the same thing. China. If we look at economic freedom in China, the swings between the Western provinces and the Eastern provinces, I mean, the Eastern provinces are probably like France in terms of economic freedom, and the Western provinces are probably like, well, jump ahead here for a second, probably like Algeria. Right, but we're taking an average for what's an enormous country. And so the larger and more diverse a country is, the less accurate for any one person's lived experiences to be accurate. That makes sense. Wait, push back.
If governments are inherently parasitic, should governments be gradually abolished?
I'll say that for the end. I don't think of the government being an entity.
Okay.
You know, operating
because
outside.
governments are composed of individuals.
Yeah. So, but let's say that's at the end because kind of gets more off top.
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay.
You had a question here, or was it answered?
No, I did have a question.
Yeah.
So let's see, like an example of the United States puts a tariff is obviously the United States would be affected. It will hurt the economic freedom of that, but does it also affect Argentina, the country which is implementing?
This is an important question. So the question is like, how do we operationalize this, which really is about individuals interacting, right? And so we use, the way we come to it is we can only reflect the constraints put on US citizens. So, for example, we have freedom to, that one, that example, so in that case, even though that's infringement on the U.S. decision infringement on the rights of Argentinians, we don't reflect that. We would only reflect if there's some sort of retaliatory tariff or something.
It does make it harder for them.
It does. So we might make, it's the same thing we think about like the freedom of travel. Like, can you go to a country, like as a U.S. citizen, I take it for granted that, we can travel to most countries in the world without a visa. But at the same time, most countries are reciprocal. You let our people come to your country, you can come to our country without a visa. Except for the U.S. We're one of the few outliers. We can go everywhere, and we've had very few countries come to our without going through the visa process. And so the way we thought about that is the U.S. is infringing on the rights of U.S. citizens to interact with individuals coming from other countries. It would be wrong to think of other countries. We could also measure other countries' policies towards us. But I think we are less free because our country won't let citizens from other countries. So that's a one odd case where in some ways it is affecting Argentinians, but we think about it through the United States, if that makes sense. Let me go on a little bit. So here's some other countries. I should highlight here, the colors mean quartiles. So most free quartiles are blue. This is important in a second. Second free quartile is green. Third is quartile is yellow, and then the bottom quartile is red. These are just bit large population-wise or countries been in the news. I could give you more. You can always go to freetheworld.com and look up the rest. Okay, here's the bottom five. Algeria, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Republic of Congo, and Venezuela. Zimbabwe is probably going to, I would guess, is the worst of their hyperinflation is coming off of our books next year. I would suspect they're going to come out of the bottom five. Now remember, again, there's a whole bunch of other countries that we don't have good data for. Now there's surprising countries that are economically free. We don't have data for it. They're too small. I'm pretty sure Liechtenstein is pretty, the Principality of Liechtenstein is pretty economically free. It's just not big enough to have data. But North Korea, we don't have data. Question? Okay. Okay, so big things we've learned. Yes?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Well, you were answering my question. I thought of another question kind of related to that. So let's say like Japan and Israel, it's kind of difficult to live there. Like they have a lot of, it's hard to get citizenship.
Yeah.
And so my question for you was, does that affect the economic freedom index? Because they purchase, it's harder for them to purchase property.
So every 5 years we sit down and we do an audit of ourselves. Like we're constantly looking for new data, but we go through each and every variable, and we bring people in and we say, like, what can we measure? The question like the young lady in the back, right? Like that's an important thing that comes up every time. Is there anything out there that we can get to better improve our data? And this issue always comes up. And the real problem is, so much of it is, it's hard to get a very accurate measure, because part of it's not only, we don't want to measure exactly what's on the books, because it could be easier another way. And we can't measure, for example, we can't use the number of people who get their citizenship, or the number of people who get their citizenship relative to the supply, demand, right? Because there might be no demand. Like, it might be easy to emigrate to Turkmenistan, but not a lot of people are emigrating to Turkmenistan, right? So I know it's not a satisfying answer. It's an important thing. I think in some ways the most important thing. If you talk about well-being, Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development basically has evidence, studies showing like somebody from Haiti, you let them move to the United States, their lifetime income goes up, considerably, right? And that's the best way we can improve the well-being of the folks in the world is letting them move to more economically free countries. In some ways, and then it is a problem. Like I care about people, not places. What do? I measure places, right? I don't care about Namibia per se. I care about Namibians. And so if the thing is say like, oh, let's let everybody from Namibia move to the United States, only 2 million Namibians. We greatly improved their lives. Okay, I want to make sure I cover everything. But these have been great questions. So what have I learned? This is what I've learned from studying economic freedom. I've been on the index since I think 2000. I've been helping work on it in 2004. I co-authored in 2008. That debate on George Orwell, was George Orwell right? Everybody's talking about the Swedish welfare state. Look, these are economically free places. When we get an accurate picture, here, look at our Scandinavian countries. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. People have private homes, they have private cars. I mean, these are, from the world's lived experience in terms of economic freedom, these are in the top quartile. And so we need to get away, at least I think, what's saying got me away from thinking about the size of government. So here on the y-axis is government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. So we have, these are the bottom, if you think about bottom 10 countries in the world in terms of size of government. They have the highest government consumption. From Luxembourg to Timor-Leste. Almost 60% of government consumption, is government consumption. What do we learn from this? Well, we got some blues, we got some reds, we got some greens, we got a yellow. If you had told me like, hey, you can live in any country in the world that's in the top 20 or 10 in government consumption as a percentage of total consumption, I'd be like, no way. I'm too risk averse. I might end up in Luxembourg, but I might also end up in Saudi Arabia, or But if you told me you could live in the top 10 in the world in terms of protection of property rights, I don't even need to look at the list of countries. Countries that solve the property rights protection problem, which basically is what? You have norms and laws that say, don't beat people up and take their stuff. Right? Now maybe it's this norm. Places with heavy norms, you don't need a lot of law. Places without those norms, okay, maybe government focuses on that thing. But I would move, now admittedly, this is my position as a male, but I would move to any country, without even looking on this list. I think my wife might think differently. But so these are the top 10 countries in terms of property rights. I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs real quick. Least free quartile is going to be on the far left. Most free quartile on the far right. Samuelson. He was talking about growth rates, but growth rates lead to income levels. Least free have 34,000 almost dollars less per capita than the most free quartile. Not only that, but they grow slower. Like, I don't worry that my 8-year-old is shorter than me because he grows faster than I grow. I'm actually shrinking. 6'3" in high school, I'm 6'2" now. I need to work on my posture. But he is growing, and he's going to converge towards me. And the same thing true. If you're coming from a low base, you should grow faster. It's easier to grow fast when you're underdeveloped. But without openness to markets, you're not going to be able to grow faster. And think about that. You have China in there. With almost those growth rates. Yes?
Do you think that's how they try to slow it down? So you're saying how so they're stopping great countries from going up, but it's easier for the lower countries to.
Do you mean we in the most free countries are making it harder for the least free
I'm
countries?
saying that they're trying to find a balance, or they're trying to
countries are trying to find a balance.
That at least, maybe that they're trying to develop, like, they can develop faster because they're trying to catch up towards, like, the United States or something like that.
Well, I think many of them, I think some of them do, right? And that's why we have the China's but I think with growth is fraught with peril, right? Think about it. Here, many of these countries are not democratic, and growth comes with changes in power, right? And so maybe we want to grow because if the country's growing, if I'm a dictator, that's more stuff, I can get a larger share of a pie, right? A growing pie, but that creates independent power bases and what do we see? We have no dictator, well, not quite right. We have almost no dictatorship in the most free, right? Or we have very few non-democratic countries in the most free. So it seems to be that democracy goes hand in hand with growth, right? So I think you kind of might see that throttling for that reason. Like growth is actually antithetical to maybe what the Dax dictator wants. We can follow up that. No. So this is my Bob Barton survey, not Bob Barton, Henley Few survey says, Jacob DeHaan, who's no big fan of the index, did this analysis of all the papers looking at growth and says, look, none of the studies summarized report that economic freedom is bad for growth, almost uniformly. Good for growth, right? And in some ways it seems like duh now, knowing what we know. But again, go back to that Samuelson graph. It used to be the norm, like that graph, and no one would see that. We might care about the poor. Okay, I don't care about growth. We might care about the poor. And so if you look at the income share, so again, the income pie, if you would, the share going to the poor is the same across quintiles. However, as a good friend of mine says, people don't eat income shares, they eat out of income. And so what we should focus on is how much income do folks have in that bottom decile. So I think bottom decile, this is the bottom 10%. And the least free have under $1,400, and the most free have almost $12,000. Now, would I want to live on $12,000? No, but I also wouldn't. I'd much rather live on $12,000 PPP than $1,350. Now, Joe Connors is a Florida State PhD, his dissertation on economic freedom and poverty. And we've had a tremendous increase in the last couple decades in the decline in the most extreme forms of poverty, this $2 a day kind of statistic. And his dissertation finds that it's those increases in economic freedom, primarily in India and China, that has led to this decline in global poverty. It's a difference between spending time with your grandparents as an adult. This is a good example because I don't think economic freedom makes us live longer. Economic freedom makes us be more productive, get higher incomes. We use that to buy stuff, which is better health. Right? So a lot of these are flowing through income, but they're still important differences. Economically free countries have higher rates of entrepreneurship. It seems to make sense. If you regulate less, government crowds out less in the financial sector, you have higher rates of entrepreneurship. How am I doing on time here? Okay. I love this.
Well, we usually run until 1:45, but since you're taking questions.
Okay, I'm good. So I'm good. That's what I thought. Okay. I love this quote because I talked to business groups a long time. They love look at the guy who talks about economic freedom and come talk to us, right? But what do they love? They love the opportunity to usually get the upside rewards of entrepreneurship. And what they don't want They really don't want a free market economy. The free market economy lets you get the upside rewards, but you get accountability for that. The accountability is if you waste resources, you lose that. You go out of business, right? So they want to privatize the benefits and socialize the losses, right? And that's an important feature about a free market economy. Why economic freedom is important because it provides that accountability. You waste resources, i.e. you make losses. Eventually you're going to have to close your door and let somebody else try. If you look across countries, those countries with the highest rates of entrepreneurship also have the highest rates of business failure. That's how we discover new things that people want is, we let people try things out. And sometimes we get things that aesthetically we think are stupid. You gotta live with that in a free society. I always think about the Billy Bass. You guys know what Billy Bass is, right? That singing bass hangs on the wall, retails for $24.99. It sings like Talking Heads, Take Me to the River, right? Like if you came to me and said, will you invest in my company? I think 1 million people are gonna pay $24.99 for this singing fish on a wall. I would have said, you're crazy. That person is a millionaire. Admittedly, again, aesthetically, this has nothing to do with aesthetics. But clearly, as an economist, clearly he created value for society. Okay, so I wanted to get a sense of this big picture. Because, look, I care about economic freedom. I wouldn't be measuring it if I didn't care about it. But other people just might get our data and use it in a study. Maybe they're against it, right? And they think we need, like we've been used to measure neoliberalism. And so they say, oh, we think neoliberalism is negatively related to growth. So I wanted to take the broadest picture I could and look at, we look at the Social Science Citation Index, which is a measure of, a smaller measure of the universe of journals that's out there, high quality journals. And we look across 214 distinct journals, econ, political science, IR, business, forestry. I mean, you name it, it's in there. And we found these 4 and 5 articles. We read them all. My co-author and I read them all, and we coded each one. We said, how do they cite us? Is it a throwaway citation? They say like, well, one measure of neoliberalism, for me at all. Then I'm not so interested in that. What we are interested in is the outcome, is the result good or bad? Like, do they use it in an empirical model? Is it good or bad? And is economic freedom a core variable? And what we mean by core is, I'll argue by no, maybe there's some bias in publication. People who care about economic freedom are more likely to find good results. So we wanted to use, to see if papers that have economic freedom in the title or abstract have different results than papers that don't use the word economic freedom. They use neoliberalism or market-oriented institutions or whatever else. And I'm happy to say that we don't find any differences between studies. People who use economic freedom generally don't find any different results than people who use some other terminology. Here's all of those papers. I ran all those papers through a word cloud generator. So, I mean, there's words you would think, economic freedom, growth. Economists love growth. Investment's pretty big. This is weighted by the number of times the word appears. Institutions, globalization, foreign, liberalization, okay. So of the empirical papers, we categorize them as, is the variable core or not core? Is the outcome good, bad, or uncertain? So, like growth, economic freedom is positively and statistically significantly related growth. That would go into the mostly good column. And where the paper was about growth and economic freedom, it would be cool. If the thing finds bad, like economic freedom is negatively related to growth or income levels, and that's what they were looking at, it would be here. And if it was like they were actually concerned about something else, but one of the other variables like was in there was negative. It would be in the non-equal. And then if the results are all over the place or they're not statistically significant, they go no effect, mixed or uncertain. So, I mean, this stuff is interesting. These 45, 11 here, these no effects, right? I just want to say it's not, can I see it? But look, almost everything is good. Now, we have this spreadsheet up online. You can go through and see if we're fairly, and we've bent over backwards to categorize things as, in fact, one of the referees on our paper said, you label this paper as being bad. I think it should be here. And we're trying to be as biased as possible as putting papers in this column. Look, you had asked me in 1990, before the first index came down, if almost 20 years of research is going to find this much good results. I don't think I would have predicted that. So this was somewhat surprising that there's only 8 actually something's not. Oh, right, that's right. One of them appears twice. That's why there's different. So this is 8 there. One of them 2 different specifications. So these normatively bad results. So less than 4% of the sample. 3 of these articles indicate that more economic freedom leads to greater income equality. That's a typo. Corresponds with greater income inequality. So more economic freedom, more income inequality. Now you might say, it's not obvious to me that that's a bad, like deforestation is bad. But people seem to think that it's normatively bad. So we code it as being bad. Now that being said, there's also 3 or 4 papers that show more economic freedom, more income equality. Yes, Leo?
Yeah, actually, since you're talking about all these different papers about economic freedom index, I just want to also say that you said that Walter Block worked on the first project about economic freedom. We have another faculty member, Professor John Levantis, who also worked on this project more recently than Walter Block. But I have the following question. Since you're talking about all these papers about economic freedom, are there any cool papers with some kind of weird results, economic freedom, like homicide rate or something like that?
Okay.
Drug consumption.
So yeah.
Prostitution.
Well, John looks at homicide rate, and his work looks at homicide rates. I mean that's interesting as a question, but so I get Google Scholar alerts, and I get a Google Scholar alert a couple weeks ago. And it says there's an article in the Journal of Heavy Metal Studies that cites my work. And I go look at it, and it's trying to predict the number of heavy metal bands, by country. And it used economic freedom as an explanatory variable. And more economically free countries have more metal bands.
I would expect the other way. I would expect that repressed country would be more.
I think it's basically, you would probably get the same result with a Nordic dummy because death metal is like really popular in like Norway, stuff like that. So I think all the economically free countries also have high heavy metal. But there's more golf courses. There's more golf courses in more economically free countries. Controlling very comfortable. I mean, you name it, people like, because you know how it is, people like get data and I'm going to correlate it with something, even though I don't have a good theory of why that might be. Yes?
You said like the correlation between the number of black, one of the size of the black market and the economic freedom.
So you would normally think, right, the more economic freedom, the less the size of the black market. So there's Travis Wiseman, who is a PhD at our place in Mississippi State. He did his dissertation in shadow content. I believe he finds that states that have more economic freedom have smaller shadow economies. Now, a shadow economy is not the same as a black market. It's not just stuff that's illegal. It just might be stuff that you move into the informal sector. It's legal, but we want to keep it in the informal sector for tax reasons, or we use it as barter or exchange, right? But yeah, I think that's right. I think more economic freedom, usually a lower general economy for black markets. Yes.
Earlier you suggested that like one of the benefits of the index would just like help us have better conversations because we wouldn't be arguing over terms.
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent you found out like actually true. Like me, for example, like I would be arguing with people, is Sweden socialist or not? So basically look at this thing, look at the numbers, they have huge tax rates, but they have like really good, free trade, really low regulation. That's the opposite of socialism defined as, basically they usually respond, oh, those are just a bunch of libertarians thinking that index, that's baloney. Or let's say like, you said like, for example, freedom of business regulation, you call that freedom. I can imagine a socialist saying, no, I think that's exploitation by corporations. I think more regulation means more freedom. I would think we could just say, well, it's fine. You call it 0 out of 10 freedom. I call it 10 out of 10 freedom, but we should at least be able to agree that it's between 0 and 10 and run a correlation and see what happens.
Yeah, so I think there's two things, right? Which one is, I frankly find, maybe it's changed me, it's not changed what people hear, but I make different arguments maybe than I do now, right? Towards people. I find people much more receptive towards that. Partly because I don't think the Nordic model, like that would be what I would argue about in the past, right? Or like I poll my students, do you think Canada's more or less economically free? And they all say Canada's less economically free. And I say, why do you think Canada's less economically free? And they all say, healthcare. And I'm like, there's lots of things besides healthcare, right? Out there. And that's the same thing with New Zealanders. Like every year we produce things and New Zealanders get angry emails from New Zealanders. How are you putting us third in the world? It's terrible here. Do you know what rights they're taking away? And I want to be like, we are measuring every country in the world. And it's kind of relative, right? You just need to travel more. and so what I like to think is it diffuses a lot, and ultimately we're not going to get away from the fundamental disagreement that, like, I still think if you believe in a capabilities approach to development, right? Like people people are economically free. Some people may not have the capability to go out and realize their true potential, right? They need assistance from others. To the extent that you think a free society can help people relative to government doing that, we can just disagree on that, right? Because part of it's like trying to project out from examples and people we know, and as well as how comfortable we are with. Some people are much more happy with a complete program that fails on many margins versus a decentralized program that might achieve on more margins, but you know ahead of time that people are going to fall into the cracks because it's not a comprehensive program. And you're never going to solve that. People are going to have different values. I just find I have more reasoned debates with people. Yeah.
So I noticed that there seems to be a consensus on two diverging trends. One is that when you look at countries specifically, inside the country you find that inequality goes up with economic freedom, and just generally historically in the United States. But then when you take a global eye view, you find that global inequality is actually decreasing for the last 20 to 30 years. I'm wondering, have you thought about trying to categorize like regions in terms of the economic freedom and then look at the inequality of a whole region as opposed to specific countries?
I haven't thought of that. I think that's a good way of trying to get at it. Look, I mean, our measures of inequality are problems, right? Like we have Gini coefficients, right? Or they're static measures, right? So really what we care about mobility is what we care about. I think the larger issue is one that played early development. If you look at development, for example, Sen talked about this in one development book. In England, life expectancy fell during like the first 60 years of the Industrial Revolution. Why? Everybody's moving to cities. We have poor sanitation. Death rates are going up. And yet more people keep flooding into the cities. And so the long-run effect of economic development was life expectancy went up. I think the same might be true of income inequality, where all these measures are short-term changes. And like if you think about now, let's say we have some huge technological innovation that people in Silicon Valley are able to capture most of the initial gains additions to that, in terms of higher incomes, we're going to have an increase in measured inequality, at least in the short run. It's unclear what the long run effects are. Or even if the reason for it's not good things, it might be cronyism, right? You get the banking sector, financial crisis, banking sector captured. Washington get rents transferred themselves. You get even more consolidation in the banking industry. It's unclear how that unfolds over time. So I think we need more. I think the more fruitful thing, just because the data would be better able to do that than kind of looking at the question you want to ask. But I think that's probably the right way to go about ultimately answering that question.
Have you guys tried to go back before 1970? Or is it just the data just gets so sketchy?
It gets sketchy. There is a guy in Spain who did an index, a much narrower index, going back to 1870 for OECD countries. But I'd love to, but especially the stuff in Area 2, it's all survey-based. Like we can't go back in time and survey people like, who are dead about what property rights were like in the country in 1970. Okay. I real quick want to say, this gets back to that earlier question. Look, that's only one dimension of inequality. Several papers look at, we have economic freedoms associated with greater gender equality and greater tolerance towards different sexual orientation. So again, income inequality is the one downside, but there's other margins on which we should consider. So I think the big takeaway that I take from all this stuff is economic freedom seems to be normatively good for human well-being. I mean, all those people have very different priors. I mean, you should see like a lot of the quotes from these here. Much to our surprise, economic freedom led to higher growth. Much to our surprise, economic freedom led to higher levels of environmental equality, as measured by, this environmental quality index. That makes me feel good, right? As somebody who cares about economic freedom, that people with different priors, this changed. It led them to results that changed their mind. And it's changed my mind. Again, it's changed my mind on the size of government not being very important. It's really, do you solve the social dilemma? Can you protect primary property rights and stop people from taking each other's stuff? At least in a decentralized way. Maybe you think the size of government is taking people's stuff in a centralized way. I think there's huge questions remaining. The biggest questions are, how do we refine our measurement? And why do these countries vary in terms of economic freedom? And I will stop there and take any questions. I know some of you probably have to leave, but I'll stay here as long as I can. Yeah.
We have time to take one question, the last question.
Okay, we'll do
Before
one
that,
break. And if anybody
then feel free to talk to Professor Hall. I just want to add, given the topic of the lecture today, I highly recommend you to read one interesting book by Hernando de Soto, The Mystery of the Capital. So I actually feel probably help you to even appreciate what economic freedom means. And
I'm going to steal the last question.
Yeah.
Just so it's not only economics. We do have $25,000 fellowships to study econ in graduate school. We also have a PhD in business. So if you're in accounting or finance or anything else, lots of money, tuition waivers for students who study those things. Just interested, we have cards in here. Come grab